Thank you. I'm going to give this paper in English because I wouldn't torture you to make you listen to it in my feeble attempts at German or any other language. So apologies for those of you who might not follow. I've made sure there's lots of visuals in case you get bored of listening to English during this talk. So I want to start with a quote. This is from a novel called The Wooden Angel that was from 1938, and it's written by a little-known author called Victor Canning, who's actually little-known. If I was in England, everyone would roll their eyes and say, who is that? He's not published a lot of work recently because he's dead, but also his books haven't been republished, is what I mean, rather than his own work. So his quote here: he was a clerk, one of 100, in a huge rambling building where individuals were not represented so much by their personalities as by their tasks. To his director, he was less Francis Jago, this is the main character, than the servant of the scholarship system. He was the file that held all the information about the scholars. He was a reference that could produce at a command the dates of committee decisions, and he was an instrument which, with pencil and shorthand notes, could suck in a letter or a report, and an hour later produce it typed and neat the paragraph for signature. I think we all know now that he wouldn't have typed it. We have our typing pool for that. I think this is a really good starting point for this paper, and quite interesting from the point of office in itself. I'm going to argue that the male office worker was depicted in British fiction, or more particularly, I say British, I mean English. I don't look at anything other than English fiction, but even more specifically than that, rather like the economic situation in Britain today. By English, I mean London-centric. So we're talking about London clerks here because there aren't many outside of London before this, certainly in the early period. And I want to look between 1893 and 1945 and discuss this image of the male office worker either as an impersonal unit or increasingly this two-dimensional pen-pushing stereotype. Now, I've Googled this, and pen-pushing is perhaps a British thing, I'm not sure. There's a debate with Americans whether it's paper-pushing or pen-pushing. There are variations, so pencil, pen, or paper, they all conjure up the same image. But it's interesting in itself that there are three different versions, depending where you come from. So Canning's novel shows us the first of these representations. And I also want to talk quickly about what they would look like. So here you have a clip from Metropolis, the Fritz Lang film, this idea of the bureaucracy, this powerful automated bureaucracy. And then you have Charles Pooter, who here is played by the lead character, well, one of the lead characters from Downton Abbey, Hugh Bonneville. But Charles Pooter, a Victorian creation by George and Weedon Grossmiths, is a nobody. He writes his fictionalised diary of a nobody. It was very popular in the UK at the turn of the century. So if we bring it up to date a little bit further and look at the British sitcom Blackadder Goes Forth from 1989, we can see this representation continues long after what you imagine the traditional clerk would have done. General Insanity Melchett calls his right-hand man Captain Kevin Darling, the pre-war employee of Pratt & Sons, a pen-pushing, desk-sucking blotter-jotter. Only Stephen Fry could say that line. I'm not quite up to it. Darling is a clerk type. You can tell that from his name. He's also called Darling, like in Peter Pan. The father, who's a clerk, the father of the young children who disappear, is also a Mr. Darling. He's a bit weak as well. He's effeminate, weak-minded, weak-bodied, and utterly subservient. And both a product of the 1980s and how little things have changed, as well as a representative of a century defined by intolerance towards pen-pushing, fictional and otherwise. So pen-pushing. George Orwell coined the term in 1936 in Keep the Aspidistra Flying, a novel saturated with lower middle-classdom and the protagonist's fear of pen-pushing in some filthy office. But negative connotations existed long before this novel was written. I want to focus on an Irish author for a second, Shan Bullock, who writes about London, so it's okay, it doesn't count, who in 1907 refers to his protagonist, Robert Thorne, as one of the many little pen drivers, fellows in black coats with inky fingers and shiny seats on their trousers. So the pen is not mightier than the sword, but symbolic of these newly literate masses, particularly those like the clerk, who no longer fit into this neatly categorised society of manual versus elite or educated labour. So as a result, you have a whole generation of middlebrow writers like Bullock and Canning and Orwell, who are particularly disillusioned with the idea of pen pushing and the environment. And so highbrow literature, the modernists, despair of what they see as the prosaic outpourings of an incoherent mass. These Clark-turned writers are sort of presenting the office as a mechanised mentality, endless competition, gender antagonism, and with this sheer monotony of repetitive work. So I'm going to examine several areas of the office environment as represented in the fiction of this period, namely the implementation of what we've all been talking about today, this mechanisation theory, and also the psychological impact of clock watching, which is what I'm also trying to do now while I'm telling this. I can feel their pain. In focusing on these formal aspects of office space, I want to look at how the clerk arrived at literary pen pushing. And in this way, I'm going to turn from looking at the laborious work of passing paper across a desk to the creative output of fiction itself, because so many of these clerks became authors. So if we look at landscape of bureaucracy, so I'm dashing in and out of the microphone, the Victorian period, as we know, saw the beginnings of this bureaucracy and the white-collar revolution, which led to an immense workforce that had to be allocated space of a professional nature, but on an industrial scale. So you've gone from the dungeon-like Dickensian London clerks in their offices underground, where the cynical and miserly clerks stooped over these ill-lit ledgers, to vast Edwardian warehouses dedicated to efficiency. But in both of those scenarios, the office space is not particularly inspiring, perhaps we could say. So the clerk has just become the embodiment of the bureaucratic process, and the new efficiency of which removed the personal elements of what had been for a long time a skilled profession. So Shan Bullock describes his fictional character's office as a long crowded room wherein his character, Mr. Ruby, sat so bare and businesslike, with its floor covering of brown linoleum, its painted walls, its litters of papers. Indeed, in Bullock's eyes, it's this brownness that pervades. So it has an atmosphere of stale tobacco, dust and stuffiness, with its 3 windows diffusing a soiled light. The tainted light is a particularly striking image. The office spaces can spoil the only hint of nature in what is otherwise a man-made and business-like space. And we see something similar in The Young Idea, a novel from 1910 written by Frank Swinnerton, when he describes his office as a dusty wilderness, even in the sunlit summer months. In fact, he says in the sun it's even more oppressive, something we get a little glimpse of right now as the sun shines and we all know it outside, because it makes the light even murkier and he feels even more trapped in this environment. Now, both these writers, Shan Bullock, Frank Swinnerton, were authors, obviously, because they wrote books, were clerks who left clerkdom, who managed to break free and write their novels. Another, perhaps more famous ex-clerk is Ian Forster, and in Howard's End, when Margaret Schlegel visits her husband, she describes the room that he's in with his clerks as the ordinary surface scum of ledgers and polished counters and brass bars that began and stopped for no possible reason, of electric light globes blossoming in triplets, of little rabbit hutches faced with glass or wire, of little rabbits. So at the turn of the 20th century, these clerks who worked in the brand new office buildings are subsumed into this collective bureaucratic function, and they're at risk of ill health by being so. An article in The Times in 1912 said one office was 120 feet by 20 feet, in which 150 clerks are packed. In conditions like these, the journalist continues, consumption among clerks was 2.5 times that of the miner. No one would imagine that mining was a less dangerous occupation than clerical work, but it's true that people are suffering from the same sorts of illnesses of the lungs, of the cramped conditions as they were in mining. Often clerk novelists refer to their work as the grind, the mill, the daily grind. This image of something more physical is linked to that ill health. Gregory Anderson, who is perhaps one of the main social historians in Britain to look at office workers, observes that of 8,334 deaths among commercial clerks between 1900 and 1902, a quarter of them were from phthisis, which is very hard to say, tuberculosis, an early word for it. Physically, then, the office experience was not always the most promising, but it's the added psychological effects of mechanisation that created the most complex of dependencies. So Frederick Taylor's influential principles of scientific management, which we've all been discussing today, meant that the spread of mechanisation from the factory to the office led to this eradication of individualism. Klinger went as far to describe conditions as monster offices in which vast numbers of clerks are herded together for their daily work. Bullock, again, has one of his clerks refer to this as sheep in a pen, calls them, the men clerks who are sheep in a pen. In these pressured times of office reform, the concept of a mechanised workforce became both revered and feared. So we've seen Metropolis, Fritz Lang's work of 1927, which was produced 2 years after Leffingwell adapted Taylor's studies of workforce efficiency for an explicitly bureaucratic audience in office management. It discusses a similar idea, but in a dramatic cityscape in which the workers toil without respite under the gaze of a panoptical central bureaucracy. In clerical fiction, the mechanisation of this work is noted by nearly every author. So Arnold Bennett, whose character Richard Larch moves from Yorkshire to London, a move that Bennett himself had made earlier before he wrote about it, he goes to work for Messrs. Kirpert and Smythe, and his first observation is that he has become part of a business machine of far greater magnitude than anything to which he had been accustomed in Bursley. Back in London, Bullock's Thorne likewise defines himself as merely part of a bureaucratic engine. He says, "One day was much like another. I felt sometimes like a machine, grinding out its daily portion, mechanically turning leaves with cold, grimed fingers." Both are automatons, and both fear they have lost all humanity, simply becoming cogs in the wheels of bureaucracy. Not only was mechanisation typical of duties carried out in the rigid structure of the working day complemented this. P.G. Wodehouse compliments on the subtle addiction of his newfound regularity in Smith in the City, another book written about his own experiences working in a bank. His main character, Mike, begins life in a bank and says, he would come at 10 and go at 5, and the same every day, except Saturdays and Sundays, all day year round, with a 10 days holiday. The monotony of the prospect appalled him, he concludes. He was not old enough, says Wodehouse, to know what a narcotic habit is. So Wodehouse was working in a bank, and his experiences in his novels are about this experience, and they're much shorter working hours than many of the clerks. So, for example, Richard Larch, Arnold Bennett's fictional counterpart, works 9:30 till 6 with half days on Saturdays. But it's the constancy that frightens Wodehouse, from going from a fairly middle-class country lifestyle to fishing and playing cricket all day at school to working in a bank every single day. As Robert Thorne, Bullock's character, opines, routine has gripped me. I was being moulded into a pattern, stiff and bloodless as an office ruler. The inbuilt sense of unquestioning repetition that characterises the older clerks that both of these young protagonists see is terrifying to them, but it's ultimately needed for the work that they're doing. So Victor Canning's other clerk, Edgar Finchley, is a chief clerk for 10 years without a single holiday because his superior, Mr. Bardwell, never takes a holiday, and he fostered the practice among his clerks. In The Young Idea, Frank Swinnerton's clerk, Galbraith, feels he's in danger of becoming nothing but a clerk by sheer enforced conformity to rule. Swinnerton suggests this is a process that begins with routine and mechanisation and which ultimately becomes in itself obsessive. So Galbraith says, he wanted work he should find difficult, and he got routine labour that demanded only care. He was feeling its first effects of enfeeblement and an unexpressed longing to follow the strong lead of someone else. For Swinnerton, then, the drudgery of the labour has created the enfeebled clerk man. Galbraith, with his superior education and his slightly elevated family position, can recognise the forces of turning him into a clerk type, but he can't resist this. He has, by the end of the novel, succumbed to the inevitability of a miserable life of mediocrity. Just want to move on to clock watching now. There are constant references to the clock as the focus of the clerk's day, and they are very widespread literary portrayals, providing this really obvious marker of mechanisation. So going back to Frank Swinnerton's The Young Idea, the ticking clock is the dominant office sound. This is a quote, "Within the building, there seemed to be no sound besides that which the clock made as it added to the flying seconds." Most famously, the clock is similarly dominant in modernist works, such as D.H. Lawrence's Women in Love from 1920, where Gudrun Brangwyn talks of being confronted by the terrible clock with its eternal tick-tack. Think also of Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway. Big Ben dominates the story, always behind and lurking. So T.S. Eliot's famous clerk, Prufrock, based on Eliot's own experiences working in a bank, declares, "In a minute there is time for decisions and revisions which a minute will reverse." So passing time is not viewed as a cycle of progress and achievement, as you might think, but rather as an impulse reinforcing the tragedy of clerical existence. So as the clock moves, they stand still. Their life is stagnant in that way. Swinnerton calls it the muffled tragedy of a clerk's life, the tragic elements of which are continuously present in the ticking of the clock. In Shan Bullock's Mr. Ruby Jumps the Traces, in which the main character decides he's had enough of office work and runs away to Gibraltar, unfortunately having what he thinks is an affair with a married woman and then coming back and being soundly beaten by his wife. His moment of indecision that Eliot talks about takes place under a clock. So he's walking on his way to work and he sees a big clock in front of him and he stands there and thinks, 10 o'clock is coming, I should be there, but am I going to go the other way? Again, in The Wooden Angel, the novel we started with, Francis Jago makes a bid for escape and he runs away to sea as a youngster before returning to become a clerk. And he's oppressed by the sensation of time passing. He says just before he runs, if only he could break away, and yet that was so difficult, and for every day that he let go by, it was more difficult still. So this inaction is symptomatic of what Michael Hollington termed the non-event in modernist fiction, a trait manifestly rooted in modernist feelings about time, and which are meant to counter the Victorian realist understanding of chronological and narrative progression. In Mr. Ruby, the clock causes this non-event, seducing Mr. Ruby into merging seamlessly into the crowd and suppressing his feelings of rebellion into a split second of inertia. The inner conceptualization of the clock's flying seconds meant that the clerk was in danger of compartmentalizing many aspects of his life. In fact, it is for these realist clerks, you could call them, because their authors write fairly realist novels, it is the constant awareness of time that makes the non-event so important. The perfectly timed journey to the station, the 1817 train home again. As early as 1889, one commentator in the Times went so far as to attribute even further ill health to the obsession with clock awareness, calling many clerks suburban dyspeptics because they eat breakfast with timetables in their minds and their eyes on the clocks. Punctual attendance, as Robert Thorne's boss, Mr. Cherry, reminds him, is expected above all things. The fear of missing the train home or the call to the office is constantly in their minds. One obvious one, if anyone's familiar with Charles Pooter, The Diary of a Nobody, is that Charles Pooter is quite obnoxious and he watches all the young clerks come in and he notes every time they're late. But the one day that his superiors bother to do that, he's the only person who's late because he missed his train and everyone has a good laugh at his expense. In the recent reinterpretation of David Nobbs' series, The Fall and Rise of Reginald Perrin, which has now been called Reggie Perrin to bring it up to date, a comment is made on the perils of this time rail travel, because the main character cannot arrive at work less than precisely 11 minutes late, or actually 27 minutes late in the current series, which I think is a reflection of the train system in Britain now, generally because of these ridiculous rail blunders, so too many squirrels on the line or other fictitious events. So the clock becomes notably important in fiction because a mantle clock later on is repeatedly offered as a retirement present. So these workers who've been fixated by the clock their whole working lives, the day they leave are offered a mantle solid clock. Mr. Josser, the senior clerk in Norman Collins' London Belongs to Me of 1938, is presented with a handsome marble clock to mark his retirement, which is very ironic considering he no longer has to clock watch. Instead, the clock's low pulsating boing only serves to remind him of the 42 years that have passed while he was a clerk. And the day that he's given it, he goes home to his wife and he tries to remember what it was like when he was a young clerk and his wife was also young and beautiful. And instead, he has just his age and this clock. His boss, condescendingly, who is being the same age as Josser himself, remarks, "No more waiting about in the rain for the same old tram to take you home again," a comment which the reluctant retiree resents. Why shouldn't he wait about in the rain for trams if he wanted to? Waiting for trams in the rain suddenly seemed entirely delightful and proper. It was part of the old order of things that he wanted to go on for ever and ever. At the end of the novel, and as the war demands more workers, Josser gets to return to his office as a much-needed worker and, by encouragement, the somebody again. And it's marked by a detailed description of a joyful and quite passionate return to his desk. In Bullock's Robert Thorne, Mr. Hope, after 37 years of service, is also forced to retire from the tax office, and like Josser, he receives his due token of a career over. After all of his years working in the same office, he's distraught at the minimalism of the goodbye. So he says, September came, and one morning in it, Thomas woke up an official no more. The previous day there had been a little celebration in the tax office, a gathering in the principal's room, a fulsome speech by the principal, and a presentation to Thomas of a revolving chair and a marble clock. His career was ended. For Mr. Hope, as for Mr. Josser, retirement is a shock. Hope goes so far as to cry, "I don't want my pension, I want to work, I want to stay here." He's ushered out by a load of typists. The following day, he sits down to breakfast, very sadly, at the stroke of 8:30 on his presentation clock, unable to grasp the fact that he doesn't have to get up and go to work. So somewhat poignantly then, these clerks are not very excited about retiring. They want to stay. The mechanisation, the clock watching have gripped them beyond to which, as Mr. Hope says, the work has become a prison, but the outside of that prison is something that they cannot understand. They are institutionalised by mechanisation. But that doesn't mean that for all clerks things went horribly, horribly wrong and they didn't enjoy their time. And they did find ways to escape this mechanised lifestyle. So there are three main forms of escape that I want to talk about. The first is they subverted office time. So you have lots of examples of clerical workers reading during office hours, some writing novels, others skylarking with fellow employees. Lots of subversion there. The second way in which clerks, and particularly clerk authors, attempted to make an escape from this inbuilt understanding of mechanisation was by writing. And this is split into two further ways of escaping. The first is that they started writing novels, but those novels were about bureaucratic concerns. They were about mechanisation. So this version of writing, this creative output, this is a predilection towards writing narratives about being a clerk, the autobiographical strand of creative outlet, which is complicated further by the contradictions between authorial success and character failure. So basically, clerks start writing novels. In them, they write about clerks who start writing novels. But the clerks in their novels don't successfully write novels, but while they do. So you have this tension between what happens to the actual authors and what happens to their fictional authors, who always fail, quite miserably as well. The second stage of writing is to write that first novel about being a clerk, get it out of the way, get it out of the system, and then start writing other kinds of novels that reach more broadly. So the broadening of subject matter into a variety of different genres and different stories, with the opportunity that is presented by that to quit being a clerk and become a full-time writer. Now the third and rather radical way of escaping this mentality is to quit their job, to leave clerkdom behind, and in most cases quit England entirely in order to rejuvenate lost masculinities. It's not essential, a lot of us did, but not everyone. Often they go to the Empire, they go to Canada, they go to America, this idea of a new world. And a lot of this is connected to the lost masculinity that has been taken from them during this period of mechanisation. So John Tosh, a social historian, mentions an incident in which 13,000 out-of-work Manchester clerks alone applied for Manitoban farming work advertised by the YMCA. They're so desperate to break away. So I think we've seen then that there are many downsides to mechanisation. These clerks are shaped and moulded by their experiences in the offices, most of which aren't a lot of fun to work in. And those who do subvert tend to subvert what they do, being a clerk, in three quite distinct ways. In fiction, you have the clerk narrative. So this is the first. These are narratives about being a clerk, these first autobiographical novels. Then you have the clerk who ventures further. So these novels are by clerk writers, but in those novels, their clerks run away, they leave, they don't want to be a clerk anymore. And finally, and at the end of my presentation, they leave altogether. Thank you.